So, hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the second session of World Braille Days 2024. This is our Writers Festival. My name is Charmaine Coe. I'm from the Center for Equitable Library Access, CELA, and I'll be your host for today. First, we'll get started with a land acknowledgement. So, the World Braille Day planning organizations acknowledge the historical oppression of land, cultures, and original peoples in what we now know as Canada. We respect and affirm the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across this land and will continue to honor the commitment to self-determination and sovereignty we have made to Indigenous nations and peoples. Please take a moment to acknowledge the lands on which you live, work, and play. And so the Accessible Libraries, the Alliance for Equality of Blind Canadians, AEBC, Alternate Education Resources Ontario, AERO, Braille Literacy Canada, BLC, the Canadian Council of the Blind, CCB, the Centre for Equitable Library Access, CELA, the CNIB Foundation, the National Network for Equitable Library Service, NNELS, and the Provincial Resource Centre for the Visually Impaired, PRCVI, are all pleased to collaborate on a celebration of World Braille Day for the month of January. Before we start off this event and get into it, we'll just go over some etiquette that happens at all online conferences. So, as with all online events, please follow good etiquette, and here are some things to follow. The first one's keeping yourself on mute when you're not speaking, using the raise hand option when you have a question, saving the use of the chat feature for urgent questions or comments. And also just to note that the information part of this session will be recorded and later posted on the Braille Literacy Canada YouTube channel. We will stop the recording prior to the question and answer portion. And with that, we're actually going to get started now. So we're very excited to have writers Andrew Leland and Jenny Saran here with us today. I'm going to ask each one of them to tell us a little bit about themselves to start off. So we'll start with Andrew Leland.
Hi there. Happy to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a writer and audio producer and teacher living in Western Massachusetts. My first book came out this past summer called The Country of the Blind, a memoir at the end of sight. And it's about my own experience of gradual vision loss, as well as an investigation into the broader world of blindness encompassing its culture, politics, history, and so on. And I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And now we'll go to Ginny. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yep. Hello, everyone. I'm Ginny, and I am a creative writing student. So I'm studying creative writing. I have had some things kind of that I've unofficially kind of published, so like blogs here and there, some poetry in small magazines. And yeah, I think. Oh, and I guess I should also mention as well, I have been blind since birth, so a lot of that as well sometimes trickles into the work that I do.
Okay, that's great. So now that we know a little bit about both of the writers who have joined us today, this will be a panel discussion the rest of this time. It will be around 9 minutes long. I'll first pose some questions to both Andrew and Ginny that center around how Braille is related to their work. And then following that discussion, we will have some time to take any questions from the audience, either verbally or through the chat function. So let's begin now with the first question, and this is for both panelists to respond to. And the question is, do themes of blindness and partial sight enter into your writing? And if they do, How have you reflected these themes? Like, have you reflected them through characters or through the references that you make in your works? And any of you can feel free to give an answer.
Okay. Yeah, so as I mentioned, the book that I wrote is called The Country of the Blind. And so I would say there are some blind themes that have entered it, because it's all about blindness. Um, but I can answer your question in a very serious way also. But I don't want to. I'd rather be playful and zesty. Um, I mean, I think one way to answer the question is, for me, is that, I'm legally blind, I'm low vision, I feel comfortable calling myself blind, although I'm also conscious of the spectrum of blindness and the social dynamics that come in there. But for me, I feel like I really became a writer in earnest when I started using a white cane and my experience in the world changed, and I started publishing articles, essays, doing podcast episodes about not only my own experience of blindness, but also this sort of larger cultural issues that it started to bring up for me. Like, for example, I did a piece for a podcast I was producing called The Organist, that was about Stevie Wonder truthers, which is this like ridiculous conspiracy theory that kind of like gets barfed up online every couple of years, where people think Stevie Wonder is faking his own blindness. And so I kind of looked into that and talked about the sort of main people who were saying it, and why. But then also, it kind of reflected back into my own life, thinking um about the way that I felt like a fraud, and like that I was faking blindness, even though I wasn't. But like, as somebody with low vision using a cane, it's like a very confusing experience sometimes. So that's like a small example of the way that I took some of the experiences in my own life and used them as an engine to write about blindness in the bigger picture.
That's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Do you have anything to add here, Jenny?
Yeah. So when I started writing and going to school for it, blindness and partial sight and all of those fun topics were something I completely actually ignored in my writing. Because I I didn't want, there's that thing of like, you're blind, you're partially sighted. That's the only thing you must be able to talk about, write about. So I very much avoided it for a long, long time until people kind of pointed out that like they wanted different stories. Like they have heard and read all the other things. In fact, I even ignored like all my other intersections in my writing until kind of people pointed that out. And then I slowly started bringing it in through stories. Um, a lot of it comes through my blog work, just because I feel like um, that's where I do a lot of my advocacy. So I'm able to bring that in. So writing about different topics about blindness to educate readers, to kind of for parents of children who are blind to be able to read so that they can have a better understanding and feel more comfortable with it. But I think now in my creative writing process with more of my fiction and poetry, I definitely bring it in. Last term I think was like the strongest one I've brought in, which was I wrote a poem based on a podcast that I had done. Because a lot of the time I find like sighted people will ask me, what would you do if you were sighted for like one day? Or what would you do if you had sight? So I actually wrote like a poem about it, and brought in the theme of like how the importance of Braille, and that, if I was sighted, it wouldn't matter because I wouldn't exist like the way that I am now. So I think that's the strongest kind of piece I brought it into, and I'm hoping that I just get more and more comfortable with it. And I think reading other authors who are blind also really helps with that process.
For sure. Thanks for sharing. It seems like you're working on a lot of interesting things and you're trying to cover um, uh, blindness and partial sight, the theme of blindness and partial sight, but trying to keep other topics um, in it as well so that you'll have a variety of things to think about, to write about. Let's move on now. Can either of you speak about Braille and your connection to Braille use? As in, is Braille only used as a way to do the writing and create the work that you're creating, or does the subject of Braille actually show up or get mentioned in the writing that you produce? And any of you can,
Oh,
yeah.
sorry. I can start this time. I think like I mentioned, like with the other question, so in that piece, Braille did get brought up. A lot of my um I think blogs, like I like talking about Braille. I think it's an important component that often gets missed. Because with all this technology that we now have and all of the available things, like there's this view that Braille is dead essentially and that we don't really need it. So a lot of the things that I try to do is talk about its importance and like how it improves literacy, but also how Braille is the equivalent of like a sighted person using print. Um, I think in terms of creating my work, I wish I could create more of my work in Braille, but then I find it hard to go back and erase things or like cut out lines. But I really like to see like finished work in Braille, because you get more sense of the spacing. If you're playing with experimental forms, spelling and grammar is a huge, huge, huge thing. And I think that it also comes to play in reading other people's work. Um, because kind of knowing what's already out there, knowing the different things that people are doing, um, really helps with the creation of my own work. And doing that just by audio, I miss a good chunk of what's happening on the page.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you have anything to add to that, Andrew?
Sure. Yeah, I love all of Jenny's comments there, and I would definitely agree with everything they said. Yeah, and I've written about Braille explicitly in my work too. Probably most substantially in a chapter of my book that's all about reading um, and literacy, which encompasses not just Braille, but some of the other, some of the history, the kind of prehistory of Braille and Braille's letter systems, and also thinking about that question that Jenny brought up of that I think a lot of blind people, particularly people, well, I think it's true of really any blind person who's in a kind of vocational rehab situation where often you'll hear this argument that like, well, technology will is all you need. And that's certainly what I heard when I went to my local the Commission for the Blind here in Massachusetts, and they were like, it's really hard for you because you're an adult already, and so like, you'll never really be able to read it that quickly, and also like you got screen readers, so don't worry about it. And I at that point I had started to sort of do my own research enough and also I'm enough of a I mean, I don't think you have to be a writer or like a particularly literary person for Braille to be an important part of your life. But for me, I care so passionately about the kind of reading that Ginny is talking about doing, that kind of close reading where it matters, what the punctuation is doing. It matters what the spelling is doing. It matters to see where the paragraph break is, or, like in a poem where the blank space is. And to me, like that stuff isn't casual. As a writer and a reader and somebody who's like really organized his life around that, those practices, that's like my lifeblood. So not only professionally, but just sort of spiritually. And so the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Braille was something that was worth investing in. And so, even before I like knew how to use JAWS, I started doing a correspondence course. First, I took Braille from a sighted um, Braille instructor. No shade to sighted Braille instructors. There's great ones out there, but this guy just was like, he wasn't a Braille reader, and he was giving me bad advice, which I later found out talking to some blind Braille readers. And so, long story short, I found a better correspondence course through Hadley in Illinois, and it took like 2 years to get through their, grades 1 and 2 programs, but I did, and then I got my hands on a refreshable Braille display, and now, I still have enough vision that like it's still more efficient for me if I really want to like drill down on a text to just use magnification to see it. But that's a moving target. I have RP, retinitis pigmentosa, so like I can't really count on the vision that I have staying stable. In fact, I can count on it not being stable. And so the way it's in my workflow now, I kind of like the way I use vision now when I really want to drill down on a text instead of listening to it. I just know that Braille will be there for me when I don't have that luxury of doing it visually.
That's very interesting, and I think both of you have talked about a topic that will come up later in the questions that we have. That topic is going to be about how Braille is portrayed. Both of you have said things like sometimes Braille is thought of as so sometimes screen readers are thought of as a substitute, and I think Jenny also said that sometimes Braille is thought of as non-existent. But for now, let's shift away and go to the next question. In both your experiences as writers, have you noticed any changes in how blindness and visual impairment is reflected or written about in literature? And any of you can chime in here.
I think for me, I think that I've noticed that there was more kind of movement towards change. Excuse me, but a lot of like, okay, how do we move towards change? So one thing that I remember learning about in classes was an authenticity/sensitivity reader. And then we looked at like texts that were you know, like disability centered, positive portrayal. In fact, I think because there was such a lack of, okay, like knowing how to move forward, knowing how to kind of depict these things accurately, I actually ended up starting a course with a professor at my previous institution. We built it. It's primarily focusing on children's books, but it's a diversity and accessibility course in literature. So looking at how do we make in this case children's literature more accessible and diverse, what books are already out there that center that focus, how can we write new books that center that focus, and how do we turn the old literature into accessible, like accessible pieces of literature that children and readers are able to access. So that's actually something that I'm currently assisting with, which I think is very cool, and moving that depiction of blindness and partial sight in literature forward.
Yeah, the representation question is interesting, and it's tricky for me. I feel like I have complicated thoughts about it. Like, there's no question that the stigma that surrounds blindness is reflected in media, whether it's literature or television or movies. And you see characters like everything from like Mr. Magoo, right? The like cartoon guy who's just like nearsighted and causing mayhem everywhere he goes. That kind of creates this stereotype of the blind person as like a bumbling fool, to like movies like I don't know, what's that Audrey Hepburn movie? Wait Until Dark, is that what it's called? Where, she's like sort of this like helpless woman at home, and this sort of like fearful, timid, object of sexual desire, but no agency. There's all those stereotypes that actual blind people experience, get reinforced through those media portrayals. At the same time, I know, like, at least 3 blind people have told me they love Mr. Magoo and that they just think it's hilarious. And like, that is part of their blind experience, is like apologizing to fire hydrants and like, you know, trying to wash your hands, and then all of a sudden like the automatic hand dryer comes on, right? So like it's tricky. I would hate it if like the only depictions of blind people were sort of like cheerleading, like, you know, sort of saccharine, you know, if we went too far in the other direction, in other words. Like, and so I feel like it's important to see blind people not just as protagonists, but also just as normal, which includes being like villains, right? And includes being all kinds. So yeah, I think the bottom line is, and I think Ginny touched on this, you know, I think those kinds of authentic portrayals really, the only guarantee that they're going to happen is if you have blind writers writing them.
I just also wanted to add, if I could, like
Sure.
I'm not sure if anyone saw like the new little Netflix mini series of All the Light We Cannot See. But that to me was a nice portrayal because there was some blind humor in there. You know, like Andrew is saying, like you gotta find that line because it's not like we don't do that at all. But then there's also that like, you know, we see Marie as still holding agency, and completing tasks on her own, still being responsible for things in a time where, you know, that might not have happened. So that to me was it's like kind of like the latest thing I've seen, and the actress is also partially sighted and playing the character Marie, who is blind. And I think that was a good representation for me, and one that I saw that was like, okay, you know what, we are getting better at it. So I think that that's a good one people should check out.
Thank you for sharing, and definitely it is something that people can check out. I had never heard of that being available on Netflix. So I'm going to pose a question now that I thought was interesting to would be interesting to ask because, and I think Andrew touched on this kind of topic of blind people having some shared aspects. I think you talked about 3 different blind or partially sighted people liking a certain writer or something like that. So we're gonna move towards that topic, and I was curious to know that even though the spectrum of blindness and visual impairment is quite large, in that we all have varying degrees of sight loss, I myself included, do either of you think that there are any shared aspects or commonalities that bring us together as a group or as a community?
Ginny, we're in this game of chicken every time a question gets asked. So
I don't know. I feel like, oh, you know, I don't want to interrupt anyone
No,
or cut
you go
anyone off.
first.
Okay. I think, yeah, I think definitely there's that shared commonality of like, you know, when you're all kind of sitting around the table and you're kind of doing that whole like, oh, this and that, right? Like you can definitely relate. Of course, there's always going to be, I think, a little bit of a disconnect because I mean, I'm fully blind, so I'm not sure, but this is just kind of what I have perceived. People who are partially sighted are kind of in that like in between kind of spot, right? So it's a little bit challenging for them. But I think once you kind of sit down together, there are commonalities. And I think that sometimes as a fully blind person, and I'm going to speak for myself, but again, I'm not trying to generalize, I kind of forget that sometimes that can be challenging for them. And like so kind of working on that from both sides as well. Because there is a spectrum, I think can even bring that even more closer. But I think in terms of like the goals that we have, in terms of the experiences that we have, the struggles with sighted people that we have, they're still the same, right? Because a blind person might be told, you know, direction wise, oh, that's over there. but someone who's partially sighted might be told, oh, can't you see it? So you can still kind of, it's different experiences, but you can still kind of, understand each other and talk about it. I hope I did a good job. I kind of stuttered over my words there. I'm sorry.
No, that's a really helpful way to think about it. Because I think you're right, Jenny. There is like kind of two two aspects to the question. There's the shared experience, but then there's also the diversity within that shared experience. And I think it's important to hold both of those together. Um, I mean, I've thought about this question a lot, and I don't know, I think there's a bunch of different ways to answer it. For me, one way today that I would maybe lean on is that all blind people, regardless of where they are on that spectrum, really, one thing that they all share, and also regardless of whether they're a part of an organization, whether they're in a blind community, or whether they're just like totally, like I don't, I've met plenty of blind people who are like, I don't like blind people. I don't like hanging out with blind people. I'm not a blind, I just like, I'm Joe and I live in, Main Street and leave me alone. All those people share a a need for accessibility in the world. And when you do see blind communities, very often, it doesn't take long for that to become a sort of linchpin of how the community is organized, whether they're talking about, transportation, education, employment, digital accessibility, Braille, whatever it is. That's all about, how blind people can have equal access to information and to the world. And so things tend to get organized around that large umbrella in a way that like does make blind people, I think, like inordinately techie. Like if there's one thing I've noticed in when I've hung out in blind spaces, it's like everybody's got their iPhones, right? Or everybody's got their, like their gear. And not, I mean, again, obviously not everybody has an iPhone, but you know what I'm saying? Like there's just like blind people need these tools, and so they use them. And then I remember, last thing I'll say about this is like, I remember when I was a kid, my dad has always been like a kind of a techie media guy. Like he was in Northern California in the 70s and the 80s when like in the 80s, like after the first Apple and the first Macintosh computers came out. I remember he was a part of like the Berkeley Mac users group, which was just like a bunch of Berkeley and Northern California geeks who like were super early adopters of Macs, and they would like meet up and talk about like, workarounds and quirks and new things that they were excited about. And like when I started hanging out in blind spaces, it was like the same thing. I was like, it's a user group. Like everybody's like trading tips on how to like, deal with the new update to Windows, or what to do with, with an audible pedestrian signal. And so there is a sense of like, there's a shared set of challenges, and then like the community can help people with information sharing to overcome those challenges.
Those are, I think both of you have made great points um, around this that are very interesting. We definitely do share a lot of the same tools and all that kind of thing. We're going to move the topic back to Braille now with a question. And I think Andrew already touched on some of this when during the last question that I asked you about how Braille shows up in your writing. You talked about some of the barriers in Braille that you've experienced. So maybe we'll start with you this time. Have you experienced any barriers to learning Braille or accessing Braille materials as you learned Braille as an adult?
This is for me, I take it.
For
Yeah.
you,
What barriers have I experienced learning Braille as an adult?
yes.
Yes, certainly. I mean, the first one I already mentioned, which is just like getting access to good Braille instruction, which like took me a lot of research and kind of like shopping, if you will, in a way that I think is different than just like the average person. I mean, the average person, like they want, obviously Braille isn't a language, but just to like to make the comparison, like if you want to learn Spanish, you have to do a similar thing of like, should I do a conversation group? You do have to find the right way for you, but I do think there's more barriers just because I think there's more work you got to do to find a good Braille instructor and to get access to Braille instruction in the first place, I think. So that was the first barrier. The second barrier, yeah, is just that I think it's just such a radically different thing, or it felt that way in the beginning. Like reading through my fingers was not something that like anything else I'd done in my life prepared me for, really, like that sort of sensitivity. But I think ultimately it just came down to discipline. And like anything else, like I'm never going to read as fast as Ginny does, and I just accept that and I'm cool with it. Because I think Ginny, Ginny, I'm assuming you learned as a kid, it sounded like. Is that true? My
Yes, so I learned literally in grade 1 where everyone else was learning their letters.
Okay, yeah. So I will, even if I just like quit all employment and spent like 19 hours a day for the next 5 years trying to increase my Braille reading speed. The sense I get from the research and my own experience is that like you would still wipe the floor with me in a Braille reading race. But hey, it's not a race.
It's not, yeah.
But that's definitely like the main, I would say like the main challenge that remains is just being able to invest the hours and getting my reading speed up to the point where it feels like it can be a part of my workflow where I'm like getting stuff done with it rather than just like this thing that I'm practicing to be a good blind citizen. And I'm getting there. I'm definitely finding improvement, but it is, it's been probably I think I've been reading Braille for like 5 years now since like, the first day, first Braille textbook arrived. And, I'm like, I can read novels and articles now, but dang, am I still slow. So that's where I'm at.
Thank you. And what about you, Ginny? Let's sort of um, see if you have had any barriers. They might be different from what Andrew's described because you learned Braille sort of at a different stage of your life, it sounds like. So do you have anything to
Yeah.
share?
So my barriers are more with accessing Braille. So I had nice steady stream of access to Braille until I was in grade 12. And then when I transferred over to post-secondary, they told me that they don't produce Braille. And that was a very, very hard thing for me because I'm a very tactile and visual learner. So at first I kind of just accepted it because I was like, okay, like this is just how it is. So a lot of my textbooks, poetry packages were in e-text or just audio. But I was like, I don't like that. Like there has to be more out there. And I got a Braille display, and that's great for I think reading prose, which is just I guess writing like maybe like an essay, but focusing on poetry because the Braille display only has one line at a time, it still doesn't give you that full page experience. So after that, I started researching and I was looking into different institutions and I found that they outsource Braille. There's places that will do it and then the institution, then gets shipped the book. So I kind of approached my institution and I was like, hey, like this is the research I found out, not trying to, you know, be a pain, but this is what I have discovered. And they were like, yes, but budgeting and money, because it always comes down to, I think, and I hate saying this, but like, dollar signs just kind of pop up everywhere because it's expensive, and which I recognize. And then it took me about 6 years at my first institution before I received of my very first copy of like a poetry in Braille. And then I switched institutions, so now I'm at a new school. And the first semester, I remember I was like, I need this book in Braille because we have to read the whole book and write like a 3,000 word like immersive like thing on it. And I remember they were like, we did outsource like 10 years ago for some other student, but here's, other ways of doing it. Like there's e-text. And I was like, thank you, but I really need Braille. And they were like, oh, just so you know, they'd always come back with some other thing, like, oh, just so you know, there's this other way. And I'm like, I really appreciate that, but I need Braille. Like just because one other student maybe does it this way doesn't mean, that I can do it that way. So finally, and we had started this process in July, and one of my professors, she was great. She was very, very helpful. And so we started the process in July. Because of all the delay and like approval and everything, it took us a long time. And the book was not received until 2 months after the assignment was originally due. So things like that are really, really challenging for me. Even this semester, although this semester I have a bit more understanding because it was the holidays, it was Christmas. I still kind of struggle because I feel like this happens every semester. But like just things that I need are not presented to me in a timely manner, even with audio formats sometimes. And I get it, there's a lot of people to produce for. But like one time, like I didn't receive my course pack until, we were completely done with it. So sometimes I'm like learning with the class, but I'm like missing. So I'm just kind of filling in the gaps myself. And I think that's the biggest barrier and access issue. In fact, of this semester, I've even said like to my accessibility services, I think I'm going to start outsourcing Braille myself. So that way I can just start on the process early, not have to get approval. And that kind of sucks because, I feel like it should be provided and I don't need it for everything. Like, I'm not going to ask for every textbook, maybe poetry. It really depends on the class. Like, but I think it's just so, so important because that's how I exist. Like, if technology fails me or if the power goes out, I'm not saying audio isn't reading, but for me it's not, and I would be illiterate. So it's just like a big thing I've had to deal with, and yeah, I think that's the biggest barrier.
Yeah, I can definitely relate. Over time, you'll find that you'll get really good at filling in gaps
Yeah.
that happen through nobody's fault, but through access issues that come up. I filled in many gaps during my undergrad and after and during my studies afterwards. So that is something that we all have to contend with. Oh, there's a shared idea relating to what I was asking before. Um, let's move back now to the topic that we were talking about before that both of you had something to say about. And it's about how blindness or visual impairment is portrayed. Sorry, it's about how Braille is portrayed in the media and how,
Hmm.
and some thoughts around that. So the question goes like this. Can either of you talk about some of the popular misconceptions that you regularly encounter about Braille? Like, for example, and this directly touches on what either of you have already said, stories in the media that come up about how Braille is no longer valued, how screen readers are a replacement. So, can either of you say something more about this?
So the question is just about like how has Braille been misrepresented in the media and
Yeah,
what can
exactly.
Yeah, okay.
address that?
Yes.
Um, yeah, I mean, you know, it's like if Braille even gets talked about at all, I
Yeah.
think it's the first thing, right? Like there's a great story, the blind writer Georgina Klieg, who's one of my favorite blind writers. I can't remember which book of hers it's in, but she has this story where there's a little girl who is in an or I guess something. I'm trying to get this right. Little girl asks her mom like, "Why do blind people live in elevators?" And her mom's like, "What are you talking about?" And she's like, "Well, that's where like the Braille is, right?" And it's like you rarely see Braille in the world, like except for in elevators, unless you know where to look for it in some ways. And so yeah, there is like an invisibility to Braille, which I think one thing that story suggests too is something that I've heard and certainly I've experienced as somebody who's trying to immerse myself in Braille is like, I think we take it very much for granted that children, who are learning to read visually are just surrounded by visual language. They're immersed, right? You can't go anywhere without seeing billboards and signs and, text on TV and text in books and text everywhere. To have the commensurate amount of exposure to Braille, you have to work, 10 times as hard. And and I think in a lot of these situations, whether we're talking about Braille or just like, accessibility writ large, like, like across blind experience, a lot of it is just invisible to people. And so I think the way to push back against it is, to, I was on a train yesterday with my Braille display reading away and like, I think that's a start. Like, one man on a train isn't going to change anything, but I think just like normalizing it and showing people in the media and writing about it and advocating for Braille is the only way that we're going to be able to push back against that sort of common sense received idea that that a screen reader will give you everything you need.
And what do you think, Jenny?
Sorry. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think a lot of the time, like, people don't even know what it is. Like, like I've seen signs where like the dots are picked out. Or like I've seen a sign for a women's bathroom where it's in Braille, but it's upside down. So like the effort has been made, but like no one's really like checked it or to like see if it's correct, right? So like it's it's there, but it's not there. That kind of like invisibility that Andrew is talking about, right? Like you have to really know. And I think as well, like how Andrew was saying, like sighted children, right? There's text on TV, there's text on your cereal box, there's text on your billboard. That I think speaks also back to literacy, right? Like that's where kids are learning their basic starting to reading and writing. If you see a word enough times, like you learn how it's spelled. So I think, like Andrew said, like the advocating, using Braille more and more, so people have to see it and confront it. Not even confront it, but like kind of confront, like, oh, what is that? What is it for? Right? Is like a way to change that. But I think, in terms of your question about um the stories, yeah, like I've seen a lot of stories in the media of like, oh, this new technology has been invented for the blind. It will definitely, speed things up, or oh, now there's touch braille. So if you use touch braille on your phone, you must not need real braille. And I'm like, no, you still do, because you're not still reading it with your hands, right? So because Braille is also becoming digitalized, and I love, Braille displays and some of that digital Braille, but we still have to remember that there's this interdependence. I think, yeah, like you can't have one without the other. Like it's not just dependent on one thing or the other. Like you can't have audio or Braille. You know, like you have to use them in conjunction and kind of, go back and forth as you need them. And I think that's something we forget. We portray it as very black and white when it's actually quite gray.
Yeah, those are both very interesting points. Thank you for sharing. We have about 15 minutes left before the end of the hour, and that is just enough time for me to pose another question to Andrew and then a question for each of you. So this is for Andrew. I noticed in your bio that you produce and host podcasts. So I was just wondering if any themes of Braille or accessibility are mentioned in any of the episodes, and for the audience to check out.
Yeah. That Stevie Wonder piece that I mentioned, well, that's not about Braille, but it is about accessibility. That was on the podcast I did called The Organist, but I did do an episode of a design podcast called 99% Invisible about the history of reading systems for the blind. And I kind of built that story around a really wonderful exhibition that you can find online still. It's called Touch This Page. That actually has like 3D printer files that you can print out if you have access to a 3D printer. And it's really, I kind of alluded to it before, but it's like before Braille, you had raised letter systems, right? Where it kind of like looked like a page of print, but the words are just rising up off of the page. And then at the same time, you also had these sort of competing systems. So like particularly in the US, and I actually don't know the Canadian history, but there's this period called the War of the Dots when Braille had made it across the pond, but then also there was like Moon Type and New York Point and Boston Line Letter, and there's all these different. Well, Boston Line Letter was one of the raised letter systems, but anyway, I kind of go into all that history, and I get to visit the archive of the Perkins School, which is the first school for the blind in the U.S., and see see some of the original Braille books. So that I would recommend that podcast for anybody who wants an audio experience about that history. It's called the episode is called The Universal Page, and it's 99% Invisible.
of the universal page. Okay, I'll definitely take a look at that as well. And are you currently working on anything new that that you can tell the audience about that they can check out?
Still talking to me, right?
Yes, you.
Uh, yeah, I'm in the process of figuring that out. So like the book that I wrote is definitely I'm like ready to take a breath away from blind history for a moment. Not that I don't love it, but like I kind of said everything I want to say about that at the moment. But I'm still really interested in like in disability and access and information, communication, language, like those kind of issues. I wrote a story, a magazine feature about deaf-blind communication last year that I really learned a lot from. Like there's sort of a new tactile language that's emerged among some deaf-blind communities called protactile. And that's just one example. I'm also really interested in plain language for people with intellectual disabilities. And I'm really interested in the ways that people make information accessible. In the same way that Braille is a brilliant, really like world historically watershed moment uh in making print accessible, or some would argue it's its own, not necessarily making print accessible, just making uh the written word accessible. So I'm interested in other stories like that that extend to other disabilities. And so I'm thinking about different magazine or possibly another book project around those ideas.
That's very that will be something very exciting, I'm sure. And so I'm going to move to Ginny now. I noticed in some of your blog pieces that you talk about the topics of disability advocacy and awareness. Um, do you have anything upcoming that you're working on that our listeners would be interested to have a look at?
Um, yeah, so in terms of blogs, it's funny because like last night I had like a random blog idea. Um, I just have to write it. Like that's my thing is I have to actually write it. But yeah, so like my blogs are very spur of the moment. As well as like actually like having the time to write them because being a student, a lot of my assignments right now are also writing. So it kind of becomes this thing of like, I feel like I'm doing it for school, which I still enjoy it, don't get me wrong, but even reading for fun now is a little bit challenging for me. So I would just say to check out the blog, which it's not just me, it's a bunch of other blind youth as well, but sometimes like I'll put in a post as well. It's called Limitless. It's done via Blind Beginnings, which is a non-for-profit here in BC. We also have our Limitless podcast as well. So I recently did a few episodes talking about some topics. One of them that we did was actually talking about that mini series I brought up earlier. So that, and then I've recently begun kind of actually trying to grow my creative writing part. So like the poetry and fiction, I've started submitting to literary magazines. Um, but that takes its time, and that's a whole other process. But I've started that journey as well. So yeah, I'm starting some things. It's a little bit more challenging being a student, but I'm really happy with kind of taking my time for things.
Okay, great. Thank you both for answering all the questions. Those are all the questions that we'd had for both of you. We're going to move to taking questions and answers from the audience now, but before we do that, I'll pass it over to Rianne from Nels, um, who will be doing the door prize draw.